So in October 1999, Etienne Balibar gave a lecture in Thessaloniki on the theme of Europe's borders. In the same year that saw the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, Balibar observed that European identity as a whole was being played out in Yugoslavia and more generally in the Balkans. He outlined two possible outcomes for the continent at this critical juncture. Either Europe will recognize in the Balkan situation not a monstrosity grafted to its breast, a pathological after effect of underdevelopment or of communism, but rather an image and effect of its own history, and will undertake to confront it and resolve it, and it thus put itself into question and transform itself. Only then will Europe probably begin to become possible again. Just as the Yugoslav wars had ended, Balibar spoke of the urgent need for reflection in understanding the factors that drove the Federation's collapse. At the same time, he warned of the dangers implied in approaching the country's breakup as an external issue. Some 20 years on, we could conclude that this vital opportunity for self-reflection was missed. Today, Europe might even seem like a continent pulling itself apart. 10 years of political and economic instability have pitted North against South, East versus West, and citizens against institutions. In what was once declared a community of peace and economic prosperity, those most disenfranchised by the effects of globalization, capital, and free markets have turned to the right to voice their discontents. Since the toppling of the Berlin Wall, and events synonymous with the reunification of Germany and the end of the separation between two parts of Europe, the EU's member states have erected walls and barbed wire fences at their borders with the clear aim of keeping others out. Yet there are some indicators that might imply that Balibar's call was in fact heard. Very often when there is talk of redrawing borders or of federations fracturing, scholars and journalists make reference to Yugoslavia and the now familiar tale of how the country's democratic transition was ultimately steered by wars, ethnic cleansing, and violent segregation. But many are reductive to say the least. Rarely do they speak of how the Yugoslav conflict was inseparable from international changes, or of how it was part of the more widespread phenomenon of political disintegration, involving a collapse in governmental authority and social norms, which rapidly escalated into claims over sovereignty itself. And even less frequently do they acknowledge that the Yugoslav conflict was not one, but rather several conflicts, which evolved over time and required different actions to prevent its descent into territorial war and ethnic violence, neither of which were inevitable. And when it comes to thinking about what insights the post-partition, post-socialist, and post-Yugoslav space, together with its transition to liberal democracy, could potentially offer for Europe, there seems to be an astounding lack of willingness to identify potential common ground. Instead, the region that is today commonly referred to as the Western Balkans, or Southeast Europe, continues to be kept at a safe distance from the EU project and its growing discontents, given that the majority of the cultural production in the post-Yugoslav space was and continues to be funded through the support of Western and European foundations. It's not surprising that the region's art has followed a similar fate. Mirroring these political processes, art history has continued to favor themes of identity, displacement, post-war trauma, and reconciliation as common grounds for the region's cultural output, implying that these experiences are somehow intrinsic to the region. They simultaneously separate the art production of the post-Yugoslav space from similar practices taking place in Europe, while validating the latter, which in contrast thrives from complete tolerance, dynamic mobility, and unlimited exchange. Of course, the pitfalls of these balkanizing tropes are all too familiar now, and the aim of my paper today is by no means to criticize the existing scholarship on post-Yugoslav art. It's rather to try and shift the discussion to a wider and less familiar field of critical possibilities. In this region, which has become largely synonymous with nationalism and festering bilateral disputes, I want to ask how art history can begin to provide ways of working so that local issues no longer seem marginal, isolated, or peripheral, but applicable to both the changing tides of European and global affairs. More specifically, I want to argue that there is an urgent need to understand the Balkans and Europe as co-constitutive of each other, and with that, to center the Western Balkans by exploring its becoming through interactions with cultural spaces beyond itself. Or in other words, what does it mean for the Balkans to belong to Europe and for Europe to find a home in the Balkans, some 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Iron Curtain, and 2 decades after the end of the Yugoslav wars? And what might the post-Yugoslav art scene's multiple transformations reveal about the politics imposed by the European North, which linked the countries of the South and East, and have arguably spearheaded the continent's nation-states to retreat to nationalism and protectionism? The methodological challenges that these questions present are a difficult subject for analysis, and tackling them in a 20-minute presentation would simply be impossible, which is why I've chosen to limit the scope of my somewhat ambitious abstract to just a handful of works produced in Sarajevo during the siege between 92 and 96, because I feel they embody the challenges I'm trying to address in my current work, in a city where these issues are pronounced like nowhere else in the region. By now, you might be wondering what this image is all about, though its connection to my paper's title will probably be obvious. The most commanding aspect of the photograph is, of course, this familiar motif of a circle of 12 five-pointed yellow stars on a blue field, which today serves as the official symbol of the Council of Europe and the EU. But before I get into an analysis of this poster and its deeper relevance to my paper, let me briefly explain the photograph itself. I took it while I was in Sarajevo this summer at the city's historical museum. I apologize for the quality of the image and the clumsy, haphazard angle at which I hurriedly took it. But the fact that the photograph's subject, this poster, has yet to my knowledge to be reproduced, and the physical display itself says a lot about what is considered worthy of attention and preservation, and about who is responsible for making such judgments. It's not difficult to miss, cornered and cramped as it is alongside these other posters in this dated glass frame, and set against a harsh black ground. You could easily walk past it as it's not particularly spotlighted in the room's austere lighting. And I think that this display testifies to the material conditions that the historical museum itself faces, which originated from the Museum of National Liberation, established in Sarajevo after the Second World War in 1949, and was opened in 1963 as a modernist concrete building that testifies to Yugoslavia's now celebrated socialist architecture. The museum still stands, but can barely make a claim for its name, to show the history of a now partitioned state that has long withdrawn its material support. Beyond occasional temporary exhibitions, the space features just a permanent display of Sarajevo and the siege in which this particular poster is located. Today, it could be said that the museum stands as a relic of the dysfunctional state it was once built to commemorate, though the untiring efforts of its staff should certainly not go unrecognized. Yet this poster tells an altogether different story, one of creative resourcefulness, improvisation, and defiance in the face of this systematic destruction. It's a work by the graphic design group Trio, which was formed in 1985 as a 3-person design team in Sarajevo and became one of the most innovative design companies in Yugoslavia. When the war broke out in Bosnia, Trio found themselves trapped until 1994 in the siege. Isolated, they produced works in the form of unique posters and postcards, restricted in scale and the size of print runs by severe shortages in expensive materials. Most significantly, their posters' iconographies were drawn from Western popular culture and symbolism, transformed in a way that condemned the failure of the American leadership to materialize until late in the day, and the impotence of the European economic community to actively intervene in the face of both massive human rights violations and a long-term threat to Europe's security. Here we have the recognizable motif of the EU, which was first designed in 1955 and officially launched by the Council of Europe in the same year with the following significance. Against the blue sky of the Western world, and note that the official symbolic description adopted by the EU omits this reference to the Western world. The stars represent the peoples of Europe in a circle, a symbol of unity. Their number shall be invariably set in 12, the symbol of completeness and perfection. In this composition, the constellation is displaced from its usual central positioning, and its complete and perfect formation is unsettled, exposed as unfinished as a figure rushes up the slope to restore a fallen star. It's a poster that testifies to how, in spite of its heavy economic involvement in Yugoslavia in the previous decades, the international and regional organizations of collective security and their member states failed to manage the crisis and prevent the ensuing violence. debating amongst themselves whether it was a civil war or a war of external aggression. As one Western diplomat at the time put it, the Europe of Maastricht did not hear the calls for help from the Europe in Sarajevo. But the reason I've chosen to focus on this poster today is because it's a work that is nothing like what we might assume to be produced in the city at this time. With good reason, the siege of Sarajevo is more likely to conjure up imaginations of, in our imaginations, the horrific images seen in newspapers and televised news. Beyond the images of destruction and despair, we might also remember Susan Sontag's famous trip to the besieged city in July 1993 to stage a production of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Sontag's trip stemmed from her determination to assemble an international community advocating international intervention, which was in turn based on her appreciation of Bosnia's secular multiculturalism, though the historic specificities of this multiculturalism and what it could and should mean for Europe are rarely delved into. But outside of Sarajevo, very few people are likely to know about the extraordinary witnesses of existence exhibition that took place over the first year of the siege in the destroyed Obala theatre space. And this is a postcard for the exhibition which shows the shelled theatre space which had recently been renovated before the war began. And this is the cover of the exhibition catalogue, which is again a testament to real kind of defiance and improvisation. The cover of the catalogue itself was printed as a silkscreen in the city's art academy, and the pages of the catalogue were printed in the Sarajevo daily newspaper Oslobođenje. And here I'm showing you a photograph of the work by Sanjin Jukic titled Sarajevo Ghetto Spectacle, which consisted of a large sign placed in the half-demolished stage of the Sutjeska cinema in February 1993, modeled after the LA Hollywood sign, but replaced with an arbitrary Sarajevo stamp. The work was a stark reminder of the parallel Olympic Games that took place in LA and Sarajevo in 1984. At the same time, it was a renunciation of the media's gross spectacularization of the siege, through which images of violence blended into a vast stream that was easily forgotten, or as the work's accompanying statement put it, of how the Sarajevo ghetto spectacle daily reached the world megastage, which had already been full and brimming with other and different spectacles. In another installation for the exhibition, Jukic took this proposition further, playing with the title of Joseph Beuys's first action in the USA in 1974, I Like America and America Likes Me. In Sarajevo Likes America and America Likes Sarajevo, through the likeness between the USA and the Olympic mountains above Sarajevo and the empty Coca-Cola cans and Marlboro cigarette packets set on the Turkish coffee tray, the artist was making a clear statement on the dominance of American influences in the region. Though seemingly marginal in their reach and impact, by standing on their own ground against Western Europe and America, these initiatives refuse to be assimilated through the game of Western compassion, and in doing so, they point to the mutually cynical relationship between the passive international community and opportunistic nationalist elites in fueling Yugoslavia's collapse, anticipating what Slavoj Žižek would describe some years later in response to NATO's bombardment of Milosevic's Serbia as a fight against its own creature, a monster that grew as a result of the compromises and inconsistencies of the Western politics itself. And in this essay from 1999 titled Against the Double Blackmail, Žižek posed the following question: how to build transnational political movements and institutions strong enough to seriously constrain the unlimited rule of the capital and to render visible and politically relevant the fact that the local fundamentalist resistances against the New World Order, from Milosevic to Le Pen and the extreme right in Europe, are a part of it. Much of the most interesting art production in Bosnia and the region at large is a kind of response to these questions and is defined by these characteristics and concerns, but are yet to receive significant scholarly attention because of a lack of funding and institutional support. They remain overlooked because they are difficult to place into the broader cultural trends that have taken hold in the last 30 years. In the 1990s, Yugoslavia's art was placed within the wider geography of Eastern Europe, in spite of having little in common with the countries of the Eastern Bloc beyond its socialist heritage. And at the beginning of the 2000s, at the height of Western Europe's post-Cold War self-confidence, another spectre was resuscitated in the shape of the more specific and problematic Balkans through a string of exhibitions staged in Germany and Austria. With that, the art of Yugoslavia's successor states was once again misplaced, this time pushed alongside those from Albania, Romania, and Turkey. Of course, something is better than nothing, and many artists and curatorial collectives from the region have now secured international recognition as a result of these developments. But almost no work has been done to examine the wider socio-political shifts that have defined and in many respects dictated recent cultural processes in the region, or to read art developments as being aligned to the particular interests of institutions, funding streams, and cultural policies, many of which come from abroad. Instead, the Balkan label continues to be imagined at this time, be it as the Western Balkan route, the Greek Balkans, or a space subject to conditional enlargement or an urgent need of supervision. In spite of almost 3 decades of international presence in the region, including the cultural support of Western European and American foundations, the Balkans continue to carry a shorthand image for nationalist fragmentation, economic precariousness, and social backwardness. So then, what conclusions am I trying to reach, and how do they relate to the conference's theme? Simply put, I want to argue that while the margins of Europe have changed beyond recognition over the past 3 decades, the case of Bosnia, and more broadly the post-Yugoslav space, are by no means unique. They speak to the dangers implied in preserving the notion of regionalism today, be that in the Balkans, Central Europe, the Baltic states, or even Eastern Europe more broadly, in privileging identities over the complex geopolitical entanglements that define art production today. But by observing why these labels continue to be imagined at this time, we might once again be able to reflect on why Europe remains far from united. In other words, what was responsible for bringing us together in the first place, and what was responsible for bringing me to a conference on East Central European art today? And what were the political driving forces? Was it the early exhibitions on East European art, like After the War and Aspects Positions? Was it the Soros Centers for Contemporary Art and their vast networks of communication exchange? Was it Moderna Galeria's Art East 2000 Plus collection, the early Manifesta biennials, or Irvin's East Art Map? Or was it Piotrowski's pioneering survey on art in the Eastern Bloc, In the Shadow of Yalta, which was for myself and so many of my peers a much needed breath of fresh air from the tired Eurocentric art histories we studied at university? And with each of these strides, what was gained and what was lost? Or to put it differently, what is it that holds us together today, and what are the forces dividing us? Only by posing these difficult questions might we, in the words of Balabar, be able to put Europe into question and render it possible again. And I chose to begin my paper today with Balabar's statement because it feels as relevant as it was when it was written almost 20 years ago. When Balabar argued that the Balkan situation needed to be seen as an image and effect of Europe's own history, he most likely had in mind the dark legacies of European fascism, along with the continent's regimes of power, including colonialism and imperialism. His call to contemplate Europe's political constitution came at the end of a decade marked by an uncompromising optimism that marketization and democratization in the newly formed Europe whole and free would replace military and ideological confrontations. Today, the post-1989 liberal order seems to be unraveling as the West loses its hegemonic grip to the rising economic power of China and a resurgent Russia, while a series of military conflicts continue to flare up in different parts of the world. The most visible effects seem to be taking place on Europe's ground itself, on a continent where the post-Cold War order was itself born and shaped. In this rapidly changing political climate, we as art historians working on subjects in Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe find ourselves in a difficult position as claims for regionalism are increasingly losing their relevance. As Edith Andras put it in her recent contribution to the excellent Extending the Dialogue volume edited by Urszka, this approach is being squeezed out of scholarly debate, losing priority in the recent turmoil of history, which pushes the commitment aside and renders it yet again ill-timed and irrelevant. East Central European art history finds itself as a crossroads with regard to its position, trapped between the forces of the global and local perspectives. Thank you.